Welcome everybody to the first faculty development workshop for the European Union Studies program that's being organized by the Center for European and Transatlantic Studies at Georgia Tech at the Nunn School for International Affairs. And I say the first because we have planned to do these for the next couple of years after this year, every fall. And beyond that, we'll see what happens. But so this is the first of at least 3 years. And today we have the first of 3 webinars. Back when we originally discussed and planned the faculty development workshop. Of course, this was before the virus, and we planned on doing all this face-to-face. But then the virus came along, and so it made sense to do this virtually instead. So instead of a single face-to-face in-person workshop, we're doing a series of 3 webinars. And the advantage of this is that we do get to expand our participation, invite others to participate who wouldn't have participated in the face-to-face workshop. So we have some students today. We have some other faculty as well. So that's a good thing, an advantage of doing it virtually. But today's webinar is the first of 3, as I've said. It's on Brexit and what it reveals about European integration. And then the next one is October the 26th, next Tuesday, on COVID-19 and related crises, risks and opportunities for the European project. And then the final webinar in the series is November the 3rd, an important day for other reasons, but our topic that day is Caught in the Middle, the EU and the US-China great power competition. So I want to emphasize that this is a collaborative effort of the European Union Studies program of the University System of Georgia and the Center for European and Transatlantic Studies at Georgia Tech, which is also a John Monnet Center of Excellence, co-funded by the European Union's Erasmus Plus program, which is managed by the European Commission. So I want to thank the EU Center at Georgia Tech and its co-director, Alasdair Young, for putting this on, helping to organize all of this. And of course, the funding comes from the center through the European Commission. Before we get started with today's webinar, though, I want to discuss a couple of protocol issues. First of all, this is supposed to be a workshop, so we want to keep that kind of intimate workshop environment. And so I'd like to ask the faculty, the EU program faculty, and that includes instructors as well as campus reps, if you could turn your camera on, and that way we can see faces. And this I think will make it more like a workshop environment. Students, on the other hand, if you're attending, please turn your camera off, and that way we'll have a sea of faces, but just the faculty that Alasdair can see, and that that we can talk among ourselves. Also, of course, keep your mics muted until the question and answer session, when we will have more of a free exchange. When it gets to the question and answer period, you can ask a question by doing one of 2 things. You can use the raise your hand function, and if you go to the top right of the screen, you'll see people. You can click that on. Down at the bottom of that, there's a bar for raise your hand, so you can ask a question that way. Be aware, however, that you're being recorded, right? So if you don't want to be recorded for any reason asking a question, if you're in a witness protection program or something like that, don't use the raise your hand function. You can instead ask a question using the chat function. Okay. So with all that out of the way, I'll introduce our speaker for today. It is the aforementioned Professor Alasdair Young. He is a professor and Neal Family Chair in the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at the Georgia Institute of Technology. There he co-directs the Center for European and Transatlantic Studies, which is a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence. He is a co-editor of the Journal of Common Market Studies, which most of you know is one of the original, if not the original, and certainly still most prestigious academic journals that deal with the European Union and European integration. He is also chair of the European Union Studies Association, or was chair, I'm sorry, of the European Union Studies Association of the USA from 2015 to 2017. He has published extensively on European Union policymaking, particularly its trade and regulatory policies. And he is co-editor of the 8th edition of Policymaking in the European Union, forthcoming from Oxford University Press. Those of you who do European Union studies know this is an iconic book text on EU policy and policy making. So I want to welcome Alasdair and thank you once again for leading our discussion today. And we look forward to hearing what you have to say about Brexit, which is a big issue on everybody's mind at the moment.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Michael, for the collaboration and for the warm welcome. I should note that that Michael mentioned the Commission funding, and I need to say that whatever you think of what I or any of my colleagues have to say, however insightful you find it, nothing can be attributed to the Commission. So that's just sort of by way of background. What's the legal disclaimer before we get started? So I'm going to be discussing Brexit. I'm going to strive to give you a dispassionate analysis, but in the interests of full disclosure, I cast my vote for the UK to remain, and I remain convinced that Brexit is an unnecessary act of self-harm. Now, there's a lot of coverage of Brexit in the news, so I'm not going to provide a blow-by-blow account. Rather, I'm going to use Brexit as a case study to illustrate broader themes about European integration and about international cooperation in general. So I'm going to talk about what the campaigns in the referendum and the subsequent challenges the UK faced in forming its negotiating position, what those reveal about the costs and benefits of integration. We'll talk about how the negotiations themselves reveal the impact of bargaining leverage, and also discuss how the complexity of untangling the UK from the EU illustrates how closely integrated the economies of the EU member states have become. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to focus on the economic aspects of the relationship, because those have been the focus of most of the attention to date. So I'm going to be leaving a lot out, but I intend to leave plenty of time at the end for questions so we can discuss anything that you think is burning importance that I have omitted. Now, as you probably recall, the UK voted narrowly to leave the European Union in June 2016. More than 4 long years later, the process still drags on. It is important to recognize that the Brexit process is the product of 2 asynchronous negotiations. The first concerned the terms of divorce, the unwinding of existing agreements. And like a divorce, it was about money, how much the UK was going to resolve its outstanding financial obligations, and the children. What would they do about the citizens of the other member states residing on their territory? The withdrawal agreement was concluded in October 2019. The UK formally left the EU in January, so in the narrow sense, Boris Johnson is correct and Brexit is done. But apart from excluding the UK from EU decision-making, the relationship has remained unchanged during the transition period, which lasts until the end of this year, and during which the UK remains within the EU's customs union and the single market, while the 2 parties negotiate their future relationship. The negotiations over the future relationship began in March. At the end of last week, both sides announced that they expected the other to compromise, which prompted Prime Minister Johnson to declare the talks over. But the EU has since indicated that it does not expect the UK to make all of the concessions. There was apparently a favorable telephone call yesterday between the lead negotiators, which raises the possibility of the resumption of face-to-face talks later this week. But time is rapidly running out to reach a deal that can be converted into legal text and ratified in time to be in place by the end of the year. So what does Brexit tell us about European integration? So the campaigns dealt with one of the things that's a central trade-off in international cooperation between some constraints on your own autonomy, the so-called sovereignty costs, in exchange for the constraints on the autonomy of others so that they will provide comparable beneficial commitments to you. While those kinds of commitments are common in international cooperation, within the EU they are particularly intense. Now, in 2014, the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition government concluded an assessment of the balances of competences between the EU and the United Kingdom. And they concluded that the balance was appropriate and beneficial to the UK. Now, that was an aggregate assessment by the government. One would expect that some UK citizens enjoyed more of the benefits of membership in the EU than others, taking advantage of travel, study abroad, working in export-oriented industries. And it's possible that some people are actually adversely affected by membership in the EU. They work in import-competing industries. There's immigrants are competing for jobs and or consuming local services, especially if there's a rapid increase in the number of immigrants, so the supply of services lagged behind demand, something that was aggravated by the very centralized nature of the UK tax and spend system. But you also had a number of factors unrelated to European Union membership that might adversely affect people's lives. Import competition from China, the global financial crisis, and the ensuing austerity program. Studies have been conducted, and all of these factors seem to bubble up in terms of reasons why the concerns in the referendum. So the Leave campaign emphasized identity, a lot of talk about we, and about autonomy that the UK can choose. The Leave campaign promised that leaving the EU would make everything better. They primarily emphasized being able to claim control over laws and immigration. The UK Independence Party, which was not part of the formal Leave campaign, was particularly close to the bone in its articulation of the us membership. The Leave campaign also talked about money being sent to Brussels, which could be used to fund the National Health Service, and the advantages of the UK being able to pursue an independent trade policy. The Leave campaign very explicitly avoided articulating a detailed version of what a post-Brexit relationship with the EU would look like, but claimed that such a deal would be easy to conclude and would secure all of the benefits of membership. Boris Johnson stated that his position on cake is pro-having it and pro-eating it, which has now become known as cakeism. The Remain campaign focused on the economic benefits of memberships, which would be jeopardized by leaving the EU. Jobs linked to trade with the European Union, lower prices due to imports, inward investment from the EU, along with estimates of what the costs of leaving might actually be. Now, these messages, unsurprisingly, were reflected in voters' motivations. 43% of Leave voters said that they were Remain voters, said they were motivated to vote to Remain because of the risk and material well-being that leaving the EU represented. 31% indicated that they were satisfied with the nature of the UK's relationship with the EU. For Leave voters, 49% identified desire to regain control over decision-making as the main motivation, with 33% noting desire to regain control over borders and immigration. But there was less a lack of agreement within the UK population regarding the appropriate trade-off between the economic benefits of cooperation and the sovereignty costs associated with being a member of the EU. This lack of agreement was reflected in the 2019 Parliament's Condorcet paradox. While a standard premise of rationalism is that individuals have a stable of hierarchy of preferences. If you prefer A to B and B to C, then you prefer A to C. But the thing is that that does not hold, that stable hierarchy of preferences does not hold when you have collective decision-making. And that's what emerged in a series of indicative votes in the UK Parliament in the spring of 2019. There was no single possible future relationship, including no deal and remaining in the EU, that commanded a majority of the Parliament. Now, normally, when there is no agreement on what should be done, the default condition is the status quo. But the Brexit vote had shifted the default condition to leaving. Now, it is worth noting that this was the previous Parliament. It's not the one that was elected in December, but it was the Parliament during the Brexit vote and through most of the Brexit negotiations. And it underlines the divisions within the UK regarding the balance between sovereignty costs and economic and political benefits of cooperation. Now, the differences over the appropriate trade-off between costs and benefits existed within the UK government, which is part of why it took 2 years after the referendum before they were able to articulate a negotiating position. Theresa May, who became Prime Minister in the wake of the Brexit referendum, responded to the concerns of manufacturing industry regarding the potential loss of market access, and was willing to accept sovereignty costs in order to preserve as much access to the EU's market as possible. This included a complicated customs arrangement to avoid the need for customs checks, continued alignment with EU goods regulations, and level playing field conditions to do with state aid, labor, and environmental rules. She accepted that the UK would have to give up access on services in exchange for control over immigration. Boris Johnson, who became Prime Minister last summer, and the Brexiteer wing of the Conservative Party are ideologically much more committed to what they call sovereignty, but is really autonomy. Their strong desire for an independent trade policy meant that the EU and the UK could conclude a free trade agreement at best. And they insisted on the UK retaining flexibility with respect to goods regulations and other domestic policy. They were essentially willing to sacrifice market access in goods, and perhaps the deal altogether, for greater autonomy. Thus, consecutive conservative governments put different weightings on the trade-offs between economic benefits and sovereignty costs. Which brings me to the negotiations. Now, from the outset, the UK had two red lines. One was to be able to control immigration from the EU 27, and the second was ending the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. From the outset, the EU was equally adamant that the four freedoms of the single market, the free movement of goods, services, people, and capital, were indivisible. Thus, the UK's insistence on restricting the free movement of labour meant that it could not enjoy the full benefits of the others. The Brexiteers were optimistic about that they would be able to retain market access despite restricting immigration, recurrence of cakeism. Their optimism reflected a misperception of asymmetric interdependence based on most EU member states exporting more to the UK than the UK does to them, which led to the view that they need us more than we need them. Viewed from the perspective of the relative importance of trade, or of exports of goods and services to the other for their respective economies, however, yields a very different perception with bargaining power substantially favoring the EU. Exports to the UK account for 2% of EU 27 GDP, where exports of goods and services to the EU account for 16% of UK GDP. Because of this negotiating leverage that favors the EU, the UK's negotiating objectives have gradually diminished in the face of EU intransigence. So May immediately had to give up on access for services, having decided to control immigration. Under Boris Johnson, the UK's determination to abandon regulatory alignment led to an objective and agreement somewhat superior to the EU's most comprehensive free trade agreement, the comprehensive economic and trade agreement that it has with Canada. Now, the Brexiteers like to point out that Canada is able to trade perfectly well with the EU, but that neglects the point of departure. CETA made trade between Canada and the EU easier than it had been under World Trade Organization rules. A CETA-like arrangement would mean that trade between the UK and the EU would be much harder than it was before, leading to significant adjustment costs. Given the EU's insistence on level playing field obligations, which I'll talk about more later, UK's aspiration is now increasingly a bare bones free trade agreement, so as to justify not accepting those constraints on its domestic policy. The UK's aspiration still goes slightly further than the CETA with respect to visa-free travel for businessmen and for mutual recognition of qualifications. Boris Johnson claims that no agreement, which he prefers to call an Australia-style deal, would be a good result for the UK. It is worth noting that Australia both has some agreements on regulatory cooperation with the EU and is currently trying to negotiate a free trade agreement with the EU. So even Australia doesn't think no deal is a great deal. Now, bargaining leverage is asymmetric, but not entirely one-sided. The EU would be hurt by a no-deal outcome. Last week, the business associations from Germany, Italy, and France called on the EU's leaders to, quote, explore all possible options to reach a solution which ensures smooth trade conditions while maintaining the conditions for fair competition between the Union and its British partner. So there are indications of some softening at the margins. Now, both sides agree that they would like to have a zero tariff, zero quota free trade agreement, which is where they're starting from. Makes this an odd negotiation. It's talking about putting barriers in place rather than removing them. So what are the major issues of contention? Well, one, oddly, is fisheries. Fisheries are not economically significant, but are politically symbolic and influential. The UK insists on controlling its exclusive economic zone, in contrast to the common fisheries policy, which gives all European fishing fleets equal access to EU waters and has collective management of fish stocks. This is an issue where the UK has something the EU wants. It's particularly important to Belgium, Ireland, France, Germany, and the Netherlands. The EU's formal negotiation position is that the future agreement must uphold the existing reciprocal access. That is almost certainly not going to be the outcome, but the member states have thus far resisted letting the Commission compromise, though one is expected in an endgame. Other long-standing sticking point was the level playing field. Because the UK is a large economy close to the EU, the EU's member states were concerned about the UK gaining an unfair advantage by lowering its environmental or labour standards or by subsidizing its firms. These fears were stoked by Brexiteer talk of creating a lightly regulated, highly competitive Singapore upon Thames. The EU's light regulation concerns were eased somewhat by the commitments in the Conservative Party's 2019 election manifesto to strengthen environmental and labour protection. But the EU remains very concerned about subsidies, and part of the problem here is that the UK government is divided. Traditional Conservative Party members like strict disciplines on subsidies. In fact, the United Kingdom under Margaret Thatcher played a leading role in promoting and drafting the EU's state raids rules, and the traditional wing of the party would like to keep those visions. The Boris Johnson wing of the party, however, likes the idea of being able to subsidize firms, ostensibly to boost technological development. As a result, the government published only broad outlines of its state aids regime last month and says they will not be finalized until next year. The EU doesn't know what the EU wants to do, so what the UK wants to do, and the indications are that the UK wants to use subsidies strategically. An issue that emerged as a major concern at the beginning of September was the UK's internal market, because it undermines elements of the Northern Ireland Protocol, which was agreed as part of the withdrawal agreement. To understand that issue, we need to consider what leaving the customs union and the single market imply for borders between the UK and the EU, which I will turn to in a moment. Thus, while neither side wants no deal, it is a very real possibility. Any deal will require both sides to give, but the UK will need to give more, given its weaker bargaining position. So the customs union and the single market have been in place for almost 3 decades, and they have become taken for granted. And economic activity has evolved in the absence of barriers. This is particularly evident in car manufacturing. The extensive nature of pan-European Union value chains means that only 1/3 of the value of a UK-produced car originates in the UK. Even before the separation of the economies, the UK has been paying a price for Brexit. Most independent estimates suggest that the UK's gross domestic product was 1.5% to 2.5% smaller at the start of 2020 than it would have been without the vote to leave. This is due to Brexit-related uncertainty depressing business and consumer confidence and hence business investment. Investment in the auto industry, which is particularly exposed to Brexit, is down 80% over the past 3 years. As a result, the UK's growth has gone from amongst the highest in the G7 to the lowest. Note that this is growth foregone rather than actual recession, which means that it is less noticeable and therefore not so politically potent. Pre-pandemic projections were that per capita income in 10 years' time after the UK leaves the single market and the customs union will be lower still. The estimate for a no-deal outcome was a drop of 3.3% in income per capita. Worth noting that with the exception of Ireland, the implications of Brexit for the EU's member states is expected to be relatively mild. There's an article in today's Financial Times about how Flanders is going to feel it quite acutely. So these are less effect in the EU member states, though non-trivial. Right? This reflects the asymmetric interdependence I mentioned earlier. Now, although COVID-19 has hit the UK's economy very hard, estimates are that the long-term effects of Brexit are likely to be much greater. The adverse economic consequences of Brexit are assumed to stem from the disruption to trade due to the imposition of new obstacles, the shift from the EU arrangement to a CETA arrangement I mentioned earlier. The UK has already announced its tariffs will be lower than EU ones in some cases, And they will become more different if the UK concludes trade agreements with countries that the EU has not, as the whole point of having it demands. Even if the UK and the EU conclude a free trade agreement, they will need customs checks to ensure that products are entitled to duty-free access and not just being transshipped through the UK because of its lower tariffs. If there is no free trade agreement, they will also need to collect tariffs. These can be as high as 40 to 100% on lamb and beef exports and 10% on car and car parts. The UK government estimates that British companies will need to complete 215 million additional customs declarations per year, which will cost £7 billion, $9 billion a year. Bloomberg estimates the costs will be double that. British companies will also have to hire 50,000 new private sector customs agents to process these forms. Now, even though the UK will have left the single market, EU rules will still apply to imports from the UK, which is why UK manufacturers want the UK to keep goods regulations aligned with the EU, as Theresa May proposed. But now that they're outside the EU, their products can no longer be assumed to be meeting EU standards, unless they must be able to demonstrate that through some form of conformity assessment. So UK organic products, though exactly the same on January 1st as they were on December 31st, cannot be sold as such without EU acceptance of UK certification. Some products require certification by another company, which raises costs. In some cases, especially food products, inspections are done at the border. There is therefore considerable uncertainty regarding what conditions will be, whether or not there is a deal. The British Chamber of Commerce announced in September that for only 9 of 36 key issues was there enough information from the government for firms to plan for the end of the transition. Moreover, the economic contraction associated with COVID-19 has preoccupied UK firms and have reduced resources, leading many to not be ready for any new requirements. According to the British Chamber of Commerce, more than half of companies have not taken any of the 8 steps recommended by the government to prepare for changes in the movement of goods between the UK and the EU. In order to accommodate new border formalities, the UK government has launched a major infrastructure development. This is necessary because as many as 10,000 trucks a day can pass through the port of Dover. Under EU rules, trucks usually clear the port in 4 minutes. Only a tiny number of vehicles are stopped. The port of Dover, however, estimates that adding just 2 minutes to the time needed to process each truck could produce a 17-mile backup, which has led to the British government beginning to develop 10 to 15 customs facilities away from the border. The UK government has also introduced 10 new IT systems that haulage firms and freight forwarders will have to navigate from January 1st, including at least 3 that are still being developed. Aware that facilities and firms are unlikely to be ready in time, the UK government is rephrasing in its requirements. So full customs declarations will not be needed until July 2021. Products of animal origin will not require checks and pre-notification until April. But the EU has said that it will enforce the rules from day one. As a consequence, the UK government last month announced the police will patrol the Kent border, Dover is in the county of Kent, to turn away trucks without an access permit, which is issued to indicate that they are cleared to enter the EU in a bid to ease disruption at the border. Now, while the short, straight crossing from Dover is particularly economically important, the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland is far more politically significant. The difficulty of avoiding a border check between Northern Ireland and Ireland, irrespective of the future relationship between the UK and the EU, was a significant reason the UK's departure slipped from the end of March 2019 the end of January 2020. For decades, Northern Ireland was torn by violence between nationalists, mostly Catholics who wanted to rejoin Ireland, and unionists, mostly Protestants who wanted to remain in the Union. The euphemistically named Troubles killed roughly 3,500 people. The 1998 Good Friday Agreement, which brought an end to the conflict, and it was seen that the UK and Ireland's shared membership of the European Union was intrinsic to that agreement. It enabled the abolition of trade border, and it created the conditions for an all-island economy. The continued ability of people and goods to cross the UK-Irish border seamlessly is widely seen as critical to preserving the peace process, which is why in November 2017, both the UK and the EU committed to avoiding a hard border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. Squaring the circle between no hard border on the island of Ireland and the UK's Brexit ambitions proved challenging. Theresa May negotiated the so-called backstop as part of the withdrawal agreement, which implied that the UK would stay in the customs union until the EU was satisfied that the future relationship would not require a physical border, in part because of technological. That outcome, however, was unacceptable to the Brexit ultras and the Tory party, as it implied postponing the benefits of leaving the EU indefinitely, and it was seen as giving the EU a veto over the UK's decision to leave the customs union. That meant that both hardcore Brexiteers and Remainers who did not want to leave the EU at all both opposed the withdrawal agreement, which is why the Parliament repeatedly rejected it during the first half of 2019, leading to Theresa May's resignation. Boris Johnson changed the map by effectively accepting a Northern Ireland-only option, which Theresa May had rejected as unacceptable. This implies that there will be a de facto border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, the implications of which have just boiled to the surface, as I will discuss shortly. Boris Johnson was able to secure a small majority in favor of the withdrawal agreement, but he was concerned that Parliament would attach conditions on the future relationship. So rather than push through ratification, he called an early election in December. His gamble paid off, securing a substantial majority, which paved the way for the withdrawal agreement in January. In September, the awkwardness of the border within the UK came home to rest with the publication of the UK Internal Market Bill. Brexit implies repatriating powers from the EU to the UK. Some of those areas of responsibility have been allocated to the devolved governments in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. The UK governments tabled a bill to try and prevent differences in rules adopted by those governments from impeding trade within the UK. In addition to doing that, the Internal Market Bill gives ministers powers to breach aspects of the Northern Ireland Protocol on state aid, on customs procedures on goods from Northern Ireland to Great Britain, and on provisions that would enable the agreement to be enforced in UK courts. The EU has insisted repeatedly that full implementation of the withdrawal agreement is necessary for the EU to conclude a new agreement with the EU. And this has raised the stakes for a dispute settlement mechanism for the future relationship, as there are now doubts about the UK's willingness to live up to the existing withdrawal agreement. Now, an issue that has received relatively less attention, which highlights the integration of the member states' economies, is the problem of connectivity. Oops, I hit the wrong, didn't mean to click on that bit. Nope. Sorry. All right, there we go. The problem of connectivity. So currently, member states, trucking companies, and airlines operate throughout the European Union. It means that they can perform cabotage, which is transport entirely within another EU member state, the so-called ninth freedom. Any agreement between the UK and the EU will make things worse. It will almost certainly lose the 7th, 8th, and 9th freedoms. That means it's more likely that trucks will run empty for at least part of the return trip, leading to higher shipping costs. Trucking companies and airlines will may well face quantitative restrictions on the number of trips which they can take, which will shrink supply, also pushing up costs. Truckers will need new insurance and driver's license and safety certification. Airlines will need arrangements for safety certification. A no-deal outcome would be catastrophic. Trucking will be reduced to only a few permits available under the European Conference of Ministers of Transport. The International Air Transport Association, which represents the world's airlines, expects that in the case of a no deal, there will be no time to negotiate a comprehensive air service agreement between the EU and the UK, and it is assumed that a bare bones agreement will be implemented to ensure at least a basic level of air connectivity. Absent such an agreement, there will be no flights between the UK and the rest of the EU27. Now, this discussion has only brushed on the surface of the myriad complex issues that the UK and the EU need to resolve, and has only touched on the regulatory capabilities that the UK is going to have to develop. As such, nonetheless, Brexit helps to illustrate how closely the customs union and the single market have integrated the economies of the EU's membership states. Thank you. I will welcome your questions.
Okay, I'll just say that once again, you can ask a question by using the raise your hand function. If you, on the right side, upper right side of your screen, there's a people icon, and you can, down at the bottom of that, the list of participants, there's a raise your hand bar you can use to ask a question. Remember once again that you are being recorded, so if you don't want to be recorded, you may want to submit your question via chat. I believe there's a student assistant on the other end who's going to collect those questions and funnel those to Dr. Young. So, any questions? See all of you there.
Okay. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I recently read a report written by the French Minister of State for European Affairs, Bonn, and one of his statements was quite interesting. He argued that if the UK had still been in the EU, there would not have been any agreement on the recent bond issue, which the EU at the French initiative launched. Could you, as we know, we had the strong opposition from the Frugal Four, and the argument presumably would be that Britain would also have been in opposition. Do you have any comments on this? This would be a kind of a result of Brexit.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly an argument that having the UK out of the way will facilitate European integration on a range of sectors. So, I mean, it's hard to know where, given Boris Johnson, it would depend on what kind of government the UK had like with Boris Johnson, I mean, he's not really opposed to deficit spending. So it's not obvious that he would have opposed the outcome. His positions on things like that is very fluid. So it's hard to know and if you didn't have Brexit, you wouldn't have Johnson as prime minister. So it's very hard to know what the impact would have been if you hadn't had Brexit. But the absence of the UK has arguably made some things easier, just defense cooperation. But
yes, it's one of those you never quite know. Yes, it's true.
I mean, in most areas of policymaking, though, the UK is not that much of an outlier. And there have been studies that go through and look at what would happen if you didn't have the UK's vote, and very few policies actually change. So that's a big one, but it's really hard to know. It would depend a lot on what the British government. I mean, if it was a Labour government, they would probably been all in. So, if you didn't have Brexit, you probably would have a Labour government, which means you probably. It gets kind of tricky to answer the counterfactual. It looks like Brian Smith has a question. And do you want to go ahead?
Let me continue on this tack thing and ask. Okay, is
Well,
someone else asking a question?
they were supposed to be asked. I can't turn this. So Michael, do you want to go ahead?
Sorry, I temporarily lost my feed there.
Okay.
But I'll go ahead. Given the the current intransigence when it comes to the negotiations, I don't know how much of it is just for domestic play back home in the UK, especially with Johnson. But what do you think is the likelihood of a deal realistically between now and the end of December? And if a deal isn't reached this year, what's the possibility that that negotiations will begin shortly after the new year, and a deal might be reached in 2021?
Well, and becoming, I think that maybe more than a. I think there will be a deal. I think Johnson will climb down. It's very hard to be able to sell that he got Brexit and then couldn't get the deal done. So I think and the consequences, even the consequences of deal and no deal have shrunk given the diminished ambitions of the UK's negotiations. The additional cost of leaving would be high, and there are concerns about how that would affect the wider relationship with the EU. So I think I think we're seeing quite a lot of posturing, and I expect he probably will climb down. But I think there's a very real possibility that time may just run out, and if there is no deal, I don't think there's going to be a lot of bad blood. I've seen some expectations that it'll take 2 years before they'll be able to start talking again. Because, and the thing is, once the UK leaves, then there'll be a lot of pain and there'll be a lot of adjustment costs, and they'll probably, if you can avoid those, that's great. But once you're dealing with that, the prospect of trying to deal with changing back again you'd rather just deal with the situation you're in rather than more uncertainty. So I suspect if the UK falls out, it won't be a quick return to the negotiating table.
Okay. If I could just follow up then, looking at the other side of it, what's the possibility that the EU will crack? And so far in the negotiations, both for the divorce settlement and for the trade relationship, the EU's shown a very solid front, and the UK has tried to divide and conquer, so to speak, but so far no luck with that. But what's the possibility that, say, Angela Merkel or Germany at the last minute decides that a no deal is just too costly, and so there could maybe some ruptures, some fissures on the EU side appear that haven't to this point. What's the possibility of that? And if that doesn't happen, to what do you attribute this extraordinary show of solidarity between the EU countries? It's been
well, part of it for a lot of EU member states, Brexit doesn't really matter one way or the other. I mean, their exposure, both positive and negative, to the UK is relatively limited. I mean, Germany is the interesting case. Right? So the Brexiteers pinned their hopes on Germany, which was both based on perhaps an exaggeration of Germany's power in the EU, that whatever Germany wants, the EU does. And it was based on the assessment that the UK is so important to Germany as an export market that German companies would demand the German government to act. And it does not really seem as though the German companies have tried that hard. And there's clearly been a underestimation by the Brexiteers about the Germans' commitment to the EU as a project. And that's, I think, the thing that's keeping the union together is this view that if we crack on this, then we're not that useful. And the thing is that even when you had the business associations calling for a deal, they were still underlining they want this level playing field, and this is deadly serious to the Germans. Right? They don't want, they want access to the UK's market, but they do not want the UK to be a cheap production platform right off the cut. Right? So while they want to preserve access, they do not want to do it at the cost of allowing the UK to be free and easy with its regulations. And that's the German government is deadly serious about that, and so are the German. So, Brian, can you ask your question now?
So I think, Dr. Young, if you don't mind me interjecting, I think Brian said in the chat that his question or his mic isn't working, so he's going to ask his question in the chat. But we did get another question from Saw Brown. They're asking, with the now taking legal action against the UK over sections of the internal market bill, do you think the Commission will be less willing to invest time and/or effort in trade negotiations because the UK is seen as unreliable, or does the Commission keep these issues separate?
Well, these are inextricably linked. It doesn't change how much energy the EU is putting in, or the Commission is putting into the negotiations. But what it does mean is that unless these issues, and the EU has been very clear, that unless the issues with the implications of the UK internal market bill for the Northern Ireland Protocol, unless those are resolved to the EU's satisfaction, they will not conclude the trade agreement. Right. So to the EU, these are linked issues, and as I mentioned, what it has done is it's raised concerns about the seriousness with which the UK, or the current UK government, takes its international obligations. There was a lot of outcry in Parliament, including from Conservative Party members of Parliament, criticizing the government's attitude towards international agreements. But because of that, you now have the EU sort of had always wanted a fairly robust dispute settlement mechanism for the agreement with the UK, and now this has just reinforced their sense that they need to have a really robust way of ensuring that the UK lives up to its commitments, because the UK has indicated that it doesn't necessarily take commitments that it finds awkward terribly seriously. And that's going to make it harder to raise the sovereignty costs for the UK, which is not something that Johnson wants. Emmett, is there another question?
Brian said he's typing a question in the chat. That was the only one I've seen so far.
Okay.
I'll go ahead and ask another question then. You mentioned the issue of personnel and staffing when it comes to the border controls after Brexit. There's also an issue when it comes to trade policy. For decades, the UK was part of the EU, so the EU negotiated trade agreements with other countries and trade blocs on behalf of the rest of on behalf of the member states. So as a result of that, I think the capacity to negotiate trade deals, maybe in terms of personnel, expertise, all of that really kind of atrophied in the UK as maybe in other countries. And so now the UK is in the position where they have to negotiate new trade deals, new trade agreements with the rest of the world, basically. Logistically speaking, do they have the capability to do that right now in terms of staff, personnel, expertise, and so on? What kind of a challenge is that going to pose?
Well, they think they do. I think they have the capacity to negotiate deals. What they've been focused on primarily is trying to roll over the deals that the EU had concluded with countries. And that's proved easier with some than with others. So they've just managed to conclude the agreement with Japan, not entirely arguably their access to the Japanese market in cheeses is now worse than it would have been if they stayed in the EU, but otherwise it's fairly close. The Canadians are apparently being awkward, are less inclined to just roll over the agreement than some others. And we have the talk about the trade agreement with the US, which they've been talking about. It's not, and there's some people who take that very seriously. I don't. But I think there is a bandwidth issue. I mean, they've had to import trade negotiators from other countries in order to staff the negotiation because, as you said, they don't have the capacity. But one of the other things is they don't have the capacity and regulation either. There are a whole bunch of areas where they're going to have to set up regulatory agencies and staff them and develop areas of competence. And this is a problem because when you have regulatory cooperation, the key feature is it's not just whether you consider what you think of the other party's rules. It's a big issue is what you think about the other party's regulators and their capacity to enforce the rules effectively. And if you don't you're creating institutions from scratch, it's hard to establish that track record of competence that would reassure partners about negotiating. So there's also this, there's a huge amount of capacity, which the UK, it's not, they did always have some regulators, but there was a lot of stuff where they didn't have to do as much themselves. So increasing that capacity is going to be a bit of
Did Brian type in another question there? Or?
Yes, we did. We did get a question from Brian. So Brian says, nearly everything said about the economic costs and benefits / distribution effects could also be said about the integration of domestic economies of states. So shouldn't the scholarly study most of the scholarly study be focused on nationalism and domestic governance rather than the economic costs and benefits of integration as a driver and or constraint of the future of the EU?
Well, there are hard. I mean, so there's studies that look at immigration. There's studies that look at austerity. There's studies, and the people have used the UK referendum because it gives them, there are surveys that ask voting preferences and linked to personal data about their positions on things, and there's also things where you can look at how votes were in different parts of the country. So it's a rich resource for trying to get at some of these questions about how the big debate about whether the backlash against globalization and the rise of populism, whether that's due to economic anxiety or social anxiety or a combination of the two. So that's what they've been trying to get at. But the answer, it seems to be, you can find evidence from those two to an extent. Right? It's how important any one is. I hope I answered the question.
Okay. Let me jump in if no one else is asking a question at this point. Do you see United States as a factor in the way the Northern Ireland question is moving? Because after all, it was the United States that pushed for and the Good Friday Agreement and a certain commitment. And I've heard, I think, candidate Biden has said something to that effect. Does that have any kind of influence on Boris Johnson?
Well, I mean, the Nancy Pelosi has been very clear that a UK-US trade agreement is not acceptable unless the Northern Ireland issue, the lack of a border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, is preserved. How much of an, and not, so the questions are how, I mean, at the moment, Johnson's very focused on dealing with Brexit and his internal political issues. I'm not sure, how seriously he takes that threat. And particularly, the agreement is nowhere near ratification. It's a long way down. So I'm not sure if he's taking that threat that seriously. I suspect some are in the British government, but they're playing multi-dimensional chess at the moment, and they may be playing checkers where they should be playing chess. I'm not sure how much bearing that will have on the ongoing currency. I mean, so that placing a border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland is a problematic issue for what's supposedly a United Kingdom. Great Britain and Northern Ireland. I see Chris Lawrence has his hand up.
Yeah, thanks. So actually, this kind of follows up directly from what you were just talking about. I guess my question is, and this is what I've been puzzling about this whole time, certainly that Boris Johnson's been prime minister, is why do you think he's proposing such a hard Brexit despite the threat it does pose to the integrity of the United Kingdom in terms of pressure for Scottish independence and in terms of pressure for Irish reunification? It seems to me that entirely contradicts, the basic premise of the Conservative Party, which, originally was the Conservative and Unionist Party, right? And I just can't wrap my head around it. And I don't know, maybe somebody else can help me wrap my head around it. But that's been sort of the puzzle I've been trying to work out the past, year plus here.
Yeah, well, I think one could say that Boris Johnson contradicts the basic premise of the Conservative Party on those things. But I think Brexit's what made him. I mean, that's what his political success came from, pushing Brexit and pushing a hard version of Brexit. And so I suspect, these implications for Northern Ireland and Scotland are essentially unanticipated by him anyway, consequences of choices he was making, shorter term choices he was making. And, I suspect And part of it, he's focused on the short term, and he's kind of hoping that neither of those things will come to pass, or at least not soon. How right he is on that, remains to be seen. Independence certainly support for independence certainly seems to be growing in Scotland, and we seem likely that will be a pressure for a second referendum. How easy it will be for him to resist hearing from the people, given that he was all about we must realize the will of the people in leaving the EU. It becomes harder to say, oh, we don't care what the Scots think. He may think that, but it's harder to. So, that's the question. But it's an interesting question, so what his calculations were, and I suspect he flies by the seat of his pants on most things, it seems, and I think it may just be that he hadn't played out all the moves, and now that given where he is busy fighting this, trying to resolve this issue without hoping the rest go away.
It's cakeism, right? Chris, having your cake and eating it too.
Well, yeah, but it kind of, in this case, it requires people, not taking their cake away, I guess. I see that Scott Brown is on the call. I don't know, Scott, if you want to weigh in on Scottish independence and what Broughton and Johnson's thinking. Michael, you still have a hand raised. I don't know if that's just not gone down or if you have another question.
Oh, I might not have taken it down. I'm sorry, but I do have another question. If nobody else does, I don't want to cut anybody off. But you showed some data that showed that the GDP growth for the UK relative to other G7 economies has tailed off since the referendum. And then you also showed projections about per capita GDP in the UK going forward relative to other EU member states, showing them lagging behind when it comes to economic growth. And that all brings to mind the reason why the UK originally joined the European communities back in first applied back in the early 60s. I mean, they of course didn't sign the Rome Treaty and join the common market. They felt it wasn't going to be that effective, and they led the way in forming EFTA instead. And then within a few years realized that this common market was working, and the European countries, their economic growth was outpacing that of the UK. They were falling behind, and that I think was at the heart of why the UK finally decided to apply to join the EU. Could the same logic repeat itself in the future, and might at some point down the road the UK realize they made a mistake here, and they're paying a too high of an economic price for not being part of the European Union, and decide to reapply, to rejoin? Is that a possibility at all, do you think?
I think it's a distant possibility in terms of it would be quite far in the future. I mean, the thing is that the UK, if it were to try to rejoin, would join on less favorable terms than it had. They will be required to join the euro, and it would be required to join Schengen. So, given that this whole issue is derived around the neuralgia against being told what to do and the sovereignty costs, it will be a very hard sell to say, not only did we get it wrong before, but we got it so badly wrong we're willing to accept something that we consider worse outcome than we originally had. So So that will be a hard political sell unless the economic consequences of Brexit are devastating, and the UK is clearly much worse off than the rest of the EU. But the projections are the UK is going to be worse off than it is now. Not that the UK is going to be reduced to being a total basket case. I'm not sure that there will be enough political will to make the case for accepting the sovereignty constraint, rejoining the EU.
We don't have. I was just going to add, we don't have a question in the chat, but we do have a comment from someone who says, "Who knows what Boris Johnson is thinking? But polls in the past few months are consistently showing that independence is now the preference of the majority. In some polls, by a greater margin than the 2014 referendum was won by no. Sturgeon has indicated in the past that consistent polling around 60% will be at the point at which the SNP will make the case for another referendum. A lot hinges on what happens with the Holyrood elections next year."
Regarding the future relationship, the question of the UK rejoining is a fraught one. But I wonder if Turkey is another country that's very important to the EU, and there's an attempt to come up with some type of a special relationship between Turkey and the EU, and I wonder if something like that could be a model for future relations between the UK and the EU as well. Something that would, certainly not involve full membership again, but might overcome some of the economic barriers. I don't know what the possibilities are there, but seems to me that there's other countries kind of in the UK's position almost that could some type of a model could be developed there.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's considerable scope for the UK to end up with a closer relationship than the bare bones FTA that Johnson is aiming for. Simply because it's all of the usual costs of trade negotiations and cooperation are adjustment from being far apart and becoming closer together. The UK and the EU are already really close together, and it's just kind of a question about how far apart they want to go, right? And so there's a lot of, and they're kind of going a long way apart, but at least on paper, right? But the question is, what is the UK going to do with all of this newfound freedom in terms of regulation? Articles in the FT today about plans on insurance, but there are certainly in things like manufacturing. I think there's going to be very little demand for divergence from EU rules. And so if you continue to follow EU rules in the UK, then there's scope for all sorts of regulatory cooperation that could reduce some of the frictions between the UK and the EU. And they can't be eliminated because the EU wants to be clear that being outside the single market means you're outside the single market. But at the same time, you could easily imagine ways to have much closer regulatory cooperation that would facilitate trade, and those would likely grow up over time. So there's a difference. So if there's no deal, I think there would eventually be a deal, and it'll probably be closer enough. But I think even if there is a deal, it will likely be augmented as over time, simply to try and reduce it.
Let me.
Olavi, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Michael.
No, go ahead. I've asked plenty of questions, so.
Okay. Let me turn to the issue of defense. Macron, of course, talks about European strategic autonomy, and he's talking about also developing European defense industries, which would involve cooperation with industries in EU countries. I assume it would leave the UK out, even though there is NATO. And then if there is a real hard Brexit, what will that do to NATO relationships and British cooperation with the European countries? With sort of bitterness.
Yeah. Actually, that was my question, Olavi, almost exactly. I was going to ask about the impact of Brexit on the future security relationship between the EU and Britain. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there are sort of two separate issues. So when it comes to territorial defense, I think NATO and the EU are, in terms of their purposes, are sufficiently different, and their personnel are sufficiently different. I don't really expect spillover from a bad breakup in the EU to adversely affect the relationship within NATO. And particularly because the UK has sort of made a point of doubling down on its commitment to NATO to offset decision to leave the EU. So in terms of territorial defense, I don't anticipate that much a problem. Also, with respect to the intelligence sharing, as also like for counterterrorism purposes, that's probably also, because that's very functionally driven and it was always outside the EU and tended to be bilateral, that will probably be all right. The problem will come with respect to the EU cooperation arrangements around Europol and the European arrest warrants and all of those kinds of things, which Theresa May, that was why she wanted to remain in the EU, because of her experience of being justice minister, was that those agreements were valuable to UK security. The UK is one of the major users of those databases, and the UK is now outside those. The thing is, the UK would be outside them anyway, even if there was a deal, because the way it's structured, the legal requirements apply only to the EU member states. So if you're not an EU member state, you can't have direct access. But there are all sorts of forms of cooperative arrangements, and so the US has cooperative arrangements. So there might be, if there's really bad blood, that kind of cooperation might be more difficult to manage. In terms of defense contracting, it kind of a little bit will depend on what Macron has in mind. I mean, if he wants to run, if I were he, I would not try and run it through the EU. I would try and do it as a coalition of the willing, in which case it might well include the UK. Defense spending in the EU is very much at the margins of got their new European Defence Agency is much more about trying to eliminate duplication and do some basic stuff on infrastructure and do some joint contracting, but it's not, the money there is not much compared to the national defense spending budget. So if I were Macron, I was really wanted to get a bigger bang from my franc. I guess my euro now doesn't work. Doesn't sound quite so good. Would look to cooperate with countries which have significant defense industries rather than go through the EU. But if he asked me, that's what I would. So a lot would depend on how he wants to pursue that objective. I've come to the time of day when I get brightly lit by the sun and begin to look at the ghost and the background disappears. Yes, Brian?
Hey, we can see you.
Oh, can you actually hear me now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. I took the 3.5 minutes it takes me to drive from home to my office. I'm sorry that my home microphone setup didn't recognize the software, so I'm not able to properly frame my question. So if you don't mind me sort of asking it again. What I'm curious about is in a lot of both policy circles as well as scholarly circles, to say nothing of the obvious use inside of media and by politicians, the commentary and study of the costs and benefits of economic integration inside the EU still seems to be constantly brought up as an open question. The distributional effects to certain people inside the UK getting benefits, as you said, from membership in the EU, and others actually having to bear costs of being members of the EU, as one example. But also all the conversations concerning, well, the UK pays X amount of money off to the EU and only gets Y amount in return. How is this not already a settled question unless one is talking about nationalism or domestic governance and the power that comes with it in conversations concerning things like Eurobonds, where I completely understand those conversations. When I was in Britain last time, if you talk to people who were pro-Brexit, after making noises about the economic benefits and this fishing processing plant shut down because of the EU, and darn that EU. After talking to them a bit, it came down to, I want my kids to grow up English and not European. And so why are these conversations not focusing always on nationalism? Why do we always have to keep talking about the costs and benefits of the economic integration? Because honestly, as I said in my question, I'm no cheerleader for neoliberal economics, but it seems a settled question. No one is talking about why the costs and benefits of economic integration of the United States. No one's talking about the costs and benefits of economic integration just in Japan. Why shouldn't every city in Japan have its own trade deals and be doing its own negotiations and have trade and have no customs union for inside of Japan? Why aren't there tariff barriers between the different regions of Japan? Because there's costs and benefits for the national government setting policy. And so I'm just curious why there's this ongoing conversation about economic, there's obviously, the EU is no United States of Europe. Obviously, it's its own thing. But it seems alive and well, this conversation of the distributional effects of economic integration in the EU and its future impact on the European integration. While it seems settled that not every city in take any random country in the world. Not every city in China should have its own foreign policy and trade agreements set up and internal customs barriers between, and then have to negotiate free trade agreements amongst them. And if there was an Article 50 in the U.S. Constitution, would New York be standing up right now and saying, "Look, we're a financial center of the world, and what works as a trade agreement for the rest of the United States doesn't work for us, so we're better off going on our own. And then we'll be able to be, because they need us more than we need them, we'll be able to negotiate even better deal with the rest of the United States on our own."
Yeah, so it's a very good point. That's why when I talked about the Leave campaign, I had identity and autonomy. And so, but as if one is trying to use what Brexit as a case study to illustrate issues about European integration. It highlights that there are costs and benefits of integration, right? You get some things and you pay, you lose on autonomy and other things. Right? And there's a question about whether you're willing to bear that. Right? And then who we are is where the identity piece comes in. But what played out very clearly in Brexit is, like, in addition to whether you got winners or losers, there was the question about whether you thought the benefits of being in were worth the costs of being in. What the costs were was socially constructed. Right? There was an argument about what being in the EU meant and what it deprived the UK of. And if you look in the polling, there is there's a lot to do with nationalism. Apparently, one of the strongest predictors of whether or not you're going to vote Leave is whether you identify as English above all else. Right? English rather than British. So, I mean, that's very much so why people voted was very much tied into issues of identity, and there's some racism was a big piece of why people voted Leave, and was what immigrants were meant by immigrants was understood very broadly by some people. I mean, if you think about the Farage sign where you're standing in front of a bunch of the poster of the line of the Syrian refugees at the German border, right, and saying these are coming, the Turks are coming. This was with the right. So there was that element to the campaign. But what I was focusing on here was how this question about whether there are economic benefits, whether they are great enough to justify the constraint on our sovereignty, is a question that governments do. I mean, the Trump administration is doing that. We don't accept any. So that's an open question, and Brexit illustrates that tension very clearly, and it ran through the parliament and it ran through the conservative government. And so then things illustrating that cooperation is not simply you get whatever you want. It is you have to give something to get something, and you may choose not to give it. And that was all I was trying to use. That's why I focused on that aspect rather than I had a bunch of slides about who voted for Brexit, and I decided not to get into that.
Fair.
Yeah, I think, Alasdair, I think we had a question from one of our students, Naaman. Do you have time to answer that, or would
Yeah.
because we're at the end of our scheduled time, but if you don't mind taking one more question, this will be the final one, and then we'll Naaman?
Hey, Professor Young. As we're winding down, I just wanted to ask, based on your knowledge and expertise, what whys would you think, in order for a reconciliation, that they would be most willing to compromise in terms of the things that they thought not worthy of joining or being a part of the EU? Where do you think they will be most willing to compromise for the EU?
Sorry, to make sure I understand. So what of the issues I mentioned is the UK most likely to be willing to compromise?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think if there's going to be a deal, it will require the UK to give something on fish, but far short of what the EU member states have now. And it will require some sort of clever construction, which will essentially imply the application of EU state aids rules. And the place the UK, the EU could argue fairly reasonably that the UK can subsidize its companies as much as it likes, as long as it doesn't affect trade with the EU. Because then once it affects trade with the EU, then the EU has a right to care about it. And so that creates this, the UK can be sovereign and can subsidize as much as it likes, as long as it doesn't adversely influence trade with the EU. The challenge will then be drawing how do you tell those kinds of subsidies apart, right? but that, the World Trade Organization has, particularly with respect to agriculture, there's some kinds of subsidies that are seen as trade distorting and others that are less trade distorting. And they might be able to come up with some sort of formulation around that. And as I said, the issue of environmental and labor standards has kind of gone away because of the Conservative Party's commitment to maintaining those standards. So having some sort of, and the EU has also eased up, but they had this, had been talk of a requirement of dynamic alignment, which meant that every time the EU changed its rules, the UK would have to change its rules. And that seems to have gone away in favor of a much more traditional commitment not to roll back or to ease regulations in an attempt to attract business, which is quite standard in EU and US trade agreements. So I think there are places where I think one can envision a landing pad. It's just a question. And I think they probably will do it, and Johnson probably will, he'll make a lot of noise, and then he'll declare victory after backing down. So I think the intention is there. It's just whether, inadvertently, by trying to take really strong negotiating positions, they just run out the clock before they can get the deal done and ratified in time. And that then becomes the risk. But it does depend on whether Johnson is bluffing or if he's really serious. I think he's bluffing, but as has already become clear, I'm not a Boris Johnson psychic.
Got you.
Boris Whisperer.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good question and an answer to end on. I think we have the outlines of a potential deal here, so we'll see if it comes to be. I want to thank you, Professor Young, for your enlightened comments on Brexit and the implications for the EU and what it says about European integration, and for leading our discussion. It was very interesting, I think. And thank you, everybody that participated, for asking excellent questions. And just a reminder that this is just the first of 3 webinars. The next one is a week from today, and that concerns the COVID pandemic and the impact on the EU. Dr. Vicky Birchfield, also at Georgia Tech, will be leading that. So we hope you'll join us again next Tuesday. But thank you once again.
Thank you very much. I'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.